in June, Rowan went from Washington, D.C. to Charleston for the grand opening of the International African American Museum in Charleston. And with her report on that, here's Rowan. Rowan?
So yeah, as long as I was on the East Coast, I couldn't, I've been supporting the International African American Museum as a charter member for some years, and they were supposed to have opened in 2020, and well, you know what happened to folks who were trying to do things in 2020. And then they wanted to open last year, but it was delayed to June 27, 2023. And since I was already going to be on the East Coast, I could not resist recruiting my friend Janice, and we went down to Charleston. So the top is a stock photo of the architecture of the museum. Obviously, it's taken from the harbor, not something I could have done. The others are all taken by me. The museum is 2 blocks from Liberty Square and the Fort Sumter Memorial. There's a haunting pavement of ghosts on the right-hand side of the screen, representing Africans lost to the slave trade. And it's the African Ancestors Memorial Garden based on the Brooks ship drawing, which I'll show later. And just some sort of harbor atmosphere pics and a photo I took of the setup for the opening on Friday, June 23rd. There was a big kickoff, grand opening community celebration in Marion Square, where we watched the live simulcast of the museum dedication ceremony, which was happening over at the museum. Before and after the live stream, there was a program with live performances from local musicians and artists. And there were 8 to 10 Black-owned food trucks and booths for Boeing, South Carolina, staffed by their Black employee group. Dream Learners Explore Charleston. I got a guidebook to Black Charleston, which was very useful. And the Barbados Genealogy Marketplace, who are trying to entice us to visit Barbados in October for something or other. But highlights included a mass International African Americans in choir who are doing gospel music. And this small picture of this fellow, Amadou Coyote, playing a 21-string kora and also djembe and kotre drums. He was amazing. The stage was right out in the sun. And so the sensible people who weren't VIPs were all under the big trees in Marion Square. I sat in the VIP section so that I could better videotape the proceedings. So this is actually a videotape from the New York Times by Leslie Ryan McKellar. And this is when you walk in the museum. This is an ongoing show of the diaspora with many, many photographs. And it was just, I can't tell you how long I sat and watched these photographs changing. So this museum honors a journey of grief and grace. That's what the name of the New York Times article was. The International African American Museum in a former slave port is about more than slavery. It's about survival and resilience. And these photos of the diaspora evoke that. And it was just, it was amazing. Like I say, I watched several times through the changing of the videos. There were obviously galleries about the transatlantic slave trade. In the 1600s, enslaved Africans and African descendants primarily arrived in the Carolinas from the Caribbean. By the 1700s, more were sent directly to Charleston from ports in West and West Central Africa. The Middle Passage to North America was one of the longest voyages, resulting in higher shipboard mortality rates than slaving voyages to other parts of the Americas. After arrival, captives were held in storehouses and aboard ships awaiting sale. As the 1807 quote in the center of this slide attests, hundreds died in those ships and warehouses. The first image is of stowage of the British slave ship Brooks under the Regulated Slave Trade Act of 1788. It was bigger than most slave ships and made 10 voyages to the west coast of Africa, carrying more than 600 Africans on 3 occasions and 740 in 1785 to 1786. It shows bodies stacked with very little room. And the small rectangle second from the right is where the ancestral paving idea came from. It's the ghosts of people who were stacked like cordwood in this ship. The diagram of the Brooks slave ship is probably the most widely copied and powerful image used by those campaigning to abolish the slave trade in the late 18th century. And so I just wanted to share, there's a painting of a slave auction in Charleston. Charleston was where most Africans who came to America debarked. And they were many different exhibits talking about where they were from and what their names were, what their names were changed to, and stuff like that. It was very moving. And then there was quite a bit, there was a gallery on Gullah Geechee, which is an overarching term for African American cultural and language traditions found along the southeastern coastal regions from North Carolina to Florida. And exploring Gullah Geechee history gives insight into those cultural traditions, innovations, and perseverance found in Black communities along the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor and beyond. So a wing of the museum celebrates the culture, and they have offered online programs on the topic, which I've attended over the years. They had a reproduction of a Gullah Geechee praise house with videos of people talking about their culture. That was very cool. And there was, of course, all kinds of African art. This first 2 pieces are by a fellow named Demond Melancon, who is a New Orleans artist. And the first one is a Jaw Defender Mardi Gras suit. And you can't really tell in this small picture, but the Say Her Name woman in the center, it's a beaded mosaic, and it's gorgeous. The other image is called Beach Dance by Jonathan Green, a South Carolina artist. And obviously I can't, show you all the amazing art that was there, but it was a definite part of the museum. And there were many galleries offering different slices of Black history. These images represent just a few. The first image gives you an idea of how the displays were set up. The other images are individual panels from different galleries. And there's a gallery called Carolina Gold, and I was really kind of fascinated by this. Rice cultivation, which was the state of South Carolina's first boom industry, the one that created the white plantation aristocracy, arrived, the grains of rice that they grew arrived from Africa with enslaved Africans who knew the technology of rice growing and irrigation. And it was on the backs of those people that the whole white plantation aristocracy grew. And that just kind of blew my mind, not that they had the technology, but that their technology was so exploited. I saw exhibits on this both at this museum and at the Charleston Museum, which I also went to. And in addition to lifting up Black history, culture, and contributions, there's a family history center to help African Americans find their ancestors. They have programs online as well as at the museum. And so naturally, Janice and I went to an introductory program whilst we were there. And I just wanted to share this amazing museum. I was so privileged and lucky to be on the East Coast at the right time and be able to go. So if you ever find yourself in Charleston, I absolutely recommend going to this museum.
Oh my goodness, what an experience. Questions for Rowan about the International African American Museum and her experience there? Questions?
I want to say thank you so much. Wow, Joan.
So Rowan, how the museum, give us a sense of the scale of this museum. Like how big and how long did it take to go through it?
So Jeanise and I are both disabled. So I'm in a wheelchair and she had broken her foot like a month and a half ago. And so she was in a boot and using a walker. So we managed 3 hours and we agreed that if we had more stamina, we would probably have stayed longer. But that was as much as we could manage. So it's a pretty big museum with really, really rich multimedia offerings. And so you could, sit for a moment and watch some videos and then go on and read a bunch of exhibits and then sit for a while and watch some videos. But we literally spent 3 hours totally engrossed in the museum.
So Rowan, have you also been to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C.?
I last year when I went to the March on Washington, I had a reservation. You have to get a reservation a couple months in advance. And when you go in to that museum, the lobby is very, multi-story, well ventilated and stuff. But the first gallery for the history section, which is what I wanted to see specifically the civil rights history and what they had on the Poor People's Campaign. But the history section starts in the basement with very low ceilings, and because they want to give you the feeling of being on a slave ship. And nobody but me was wearing masks. And so I went down the elevator to that floor and went, excuse me, Mr. Elevator Operator, would you please take me back upstairs? I can't do this. And so I fled. So no, I have not. I have been, there are 2 African American museums in DC. There's that one, which is a history museum, and then there's the African American Art Museum, which I went to this year. And if you follow me on Facebook, you saw some amazing photos from the Deeps exhibit that I went to this year. But no, I haven't. Although one of the things in Charleston that's very they have a history of iron work, of beautiful gates and arches and whatnot. And they had a fellow who was born in like 1912 and passed away in I think 2014 or something, who had a 50-year career of doing ironwork and was this master iron worker. And he has a piece in the African American Museum in Washington, as well as, so I sort of spent a lot of time in Charleston going around looking for Mr. Simmons' work and enjoying that. The Liberty Square gate that I showed you is one of his works. I'm sorry, Charleston has brick sidewalks. It was not a wheelchair friendly place. I mean, DC has brick sidewalks, but they have mortar. Charleston has brick sidewalks that don't have mortar. And so it's kind of like rippled, with potholes and raised bits. And so after a few days of that, I was pretty done with rolling around sightseeing. So apologies.
None needed. Other questions for Rowan about the International African American Museum experience? So Rowan, what was your internal experience of going there? I mean, you just come from the Poor People's Campaign, and now here's this huge festive opening of an International African American Museum. How did all that play out as an experience?
Well, yes, it was a big opening, but it's an opening of a museum on Gadsden's Wharf, the site that most Africans who were brought to this country as slaves saw as their first vision of America. So I really felt like it was systemic racism is one of the pillars of the Poor People's Campaign, and the historic roots of that systemic racism were very well documented in Charleston, both in the Charleston Museum and in the International African American Museum. And so I really felt like it wasn't a festive thing as much as it was a learning thing. And I was born in Charleston, South Carolina. I have never lived there. That was where my dad went to medical school or did his residency or something like that. We left when I was like 2.5. And so I have no ties to Charleston, but I felt like it was kind of a pilgrimage to the place of my birth, for which I had some responsibility for the horrors, just because I was born there. And so I really saw it more as a pilgrimage than as a celebration for me.
And was that the kind of the overlying atmosphere also was the solemnity?
I think there was definitely a lot of solemnity. Like I said, there were all kinds of folks. I mean, the Obamas sent a video for the opening, and so there were lots of talking heads. Unfortunately, the live stream to those of us who were in Marion Square from the actual museum was on some kind of jumbotron thing that was not photographable. It gave you black lines and stuff, so I couldn't actually video any of the really cool things, but people were really seeing it as an opportunity to teach the nation about some things that some states don't want us to talk about. And I think it was seen with some solemnity. There was certainly celebration. I mean, they've been trying to get this museum open for a couple decades now, and really intensely in the last decade. And so, like I say, as a charter member, of which, I mean, there were 20,000 charter members. There's nothing, special about me being a charter member, except that I felt called to do that, but I've gone to a lot of online programming that they've done. They have a spirituality track that they do some online programming. They do Gullah Geechee, they do genealogy. And so I think it's going to be an amazing resource for the community, both in Charleston and around the country. So I feel very privileged that I got to go.
And Rowan, you just said that you feel privileged. I feel privileged to hear you talk about it and to see the images that you were able to capture and share. Thank you so much. Wow.
So this is in the South, and the South is one of those areas where teaching about this stuff is very controversial, and it's being outlawed in some places. So how do you see this as a vehicle, a tool to help overcome some of that?
Well, Charleston and South Carolina are not on that bandwagon, thankfully. I mean, the mayor of Charleston was one of the speakers at the opening ceremonies. They're happy to have the museum there. But I do think that the fact that it's there, the fact that it's in the location that it is, I mean, you have Fort Sumter, it's 2 blocks away from the Fort Sumter Memorial. So it's right there in Liberty Square, next to Liberty Square, where there are lots of information. It's a park that has explainers in it, about people, civil rights leaders from South Carolina, just different eras of things. And so it's in a place where I think it's really embedded in history. And I love museums of place. So I did also go to the Charleston Museum, which is a museum of the history of Charleston. And they also had a lot of information on the rice cultivation thing. And they really acknowledge the debt that they owe as a state to the enslaved people who brought over the rice technology. I mean, the rice itself came from Africa. The people who knew how to grow it came from Africa. The fact that it then enriched a bunch of white people is seen as a stain. And I have to agree, because that's rice cultivation is backbreaking work, as anybody who's seen people, bending over in rice paddies around the world knows, but even worse if you have enslavers as your overseers.
That gives us a flavor of what it was like to be there. Anything else you'd like to add that was important about your visit to Charleston and the International African American Museum?
No, I think I've said what I needed to say, but thank you for listening to both my MPAC report and my little add-on of what I did as long as I was on the East Coast, which I was really lucky, I think, to be able to do. I bought my tickets for the opening day, the day they went on sale. They released them to charter members first. And I was like, okay, June 27th, I'm going to be in DC, June 21 to 22, 19 to 22 or whatever. The following week, I'm going to be in Charleston. And I made it happen. So.
And I think you're right. It was very, very interesting. I myself is very much what Florida's doing, talking about
Black history
in their state and what their education system is going to be doing. But I really appreciate you doing that and sharing that with us. It's very interesting. It's also, of course, when our biggest stain in our country is done in enslaving people. And I was reading about what DeSantis is doing, and I got so angry. And it's nice to hear some of the history and your moral sense that somehow, just because you were born in North Carolina, you bore some responsibility. Of course, you didn't, but how your moral sense is that we all are responsible. We all are in a way, but I really, I appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions for Rowan or about the museum? I've put everything in the chat and I will forward that to anybody who needs it.
Very interesting, Rowan. The British Square, yeah, but this thing you did was amazing with your, how capable can one be? But everything you did there, that's just awesome.
Shirley,
Thank
I see you've unmuted. You got a question?
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate all that Rowan has done with this by visiting her birth state of South Carolina. My daughter sent her family, that included me, my husband, and her children and husband, on what she called a civil rights tour of the Deep South. And it was very revealing. And what Rowan has shared just adds on to that. And as far as the Deep South trying to hide its racist past and slavery, I didn't find that they were hiding anything. We went to Montgomery, Alabama, where they had those, a lot of the civil rights movement started to. And there were displays everywhere. What I didn't see was a lot of tourists. I didn't see a lot of people who were visiting places in the Deep South to look at the civil rights movement's history and of the Black history. And I learned a lot, but I think what Rowan has shared is so special because it's something that, is embedded in her own heritage. And I found that what you had to share was very fascinating, especially about the rice culture and the Gula Kichi people. My daughter happens to be very fascinated by the quilt making in that region. So
Yes. They do amazing quilts. There was a quilt in one of my slides that I then put something else in instead, but yes, they do amazing quilts in that part of the country.
I really appreciate your report. I hope that it was recorded, that it can be shared.
Yeah, it'll be up on our on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. Probably I'm going to do 2 videos, one of the MPAC and one of the museum, just to make it easier for people to see what they're interested in.
Great.
But, and I have been to the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, Alabama. And so, yes, there are definitely other excellent museums around the South. But this one is a little different. It's not a civil rights museum, although there are parts of it that are about civil rights, but it's really about South Carolina history and the diaspora, and amazing, and some amazing art. Like I say, I loved that Mardi Gras costume, for example. The back was just as cool as the front was. But I didn't want to get too wordy with the pictures.
But Mardi Gras is usually associated with New Orleans.
Right.
New
Well,
Orleans.
the artist is in New Orleans.
Yeah.
That I
So
mentioned.
That's interesting that it spread to other states too. So.
Well, they were showcasing African American artists.
Uh-huh.
They weren't all from South Carolina, obviously. He's a
Right.
Louisiana artist. Yeah.
Mhm.
But they had sections of art, as well as sections of history and sections of contemporary. They had interviews with a lot of African American, like professors at Charleston University, or state people who were just sort of talking about their own lives and stuff. I mean, it was fascinating. I mean, I barely scratched the surface of the scope of the exhibits at that. It was wonderful.
Great. I'm glad you shared. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful. Any other comments or questions? I see your hand, Joan.
Rowan's, you were just saying how much there is there, and then they'll probably have new exhibits and some that go away and so on. Do you think that they will be doing any kind of audio visual recording for those of us who can't get there realistically?
Well, like I say, they have programming, if they have programming on Gullah Geechee or on any of the things. I've been to some really interesting programs over the last couple of years that they've produced. I don't know that they'll do a video tour of the museum itself. I have no idea, but checking their calendar on their website to see what upcoming Zoom meetings they have is probably worth doing.
And I'm going to enter into chat a book I highly recommend, which is called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And Clint Smith is a journalist with The Atlantic, and he visited 20 plus historical sites as a journalist and then wrote about them, selected a few. It's really informative about how our historical sites report on the history of African Americans. And it is very enlightening, so I highly recommend it. Any other questions for Rowan? Oh, I just want to once again thank Rowan. Hey, Rowan, this was really wonderful. I appreciate, and you brought it to WILPF. You were there both on the behalf of the Poor People's Campaign and part of WILPF, because you are on, what's your role with WILPF on this?
I'm the national liaison from WILPF to the PPC. and so I will be sending a report about this to eNews, and I'll send a link to the video of this report back, probably to the list and also to eNews, so that if people are interested. That's why I'm going to do it as 2 separate things, so that the people from WILPF who want to come hear about MPAC don't have to also hear about the African American Museum. So there will be two videos. So can the Raging Grannies take us out? I'm sorry, I'm running out of sitting up time.